The French government set to announce its plan to help the country's culture industry. It employs more than 1 million people, some of them taking part in a video conference right now with the president and several ministers. As Germany's Chancellor prepares to speak to the premiers of her country's 16 states, we'll talk to our business editor Stephen Carroll about a draft document that indicates they've agreed all shops will reopen and amateur sport restart. And the Trump administration says it plans to wind down the coronavirus task force. And as millions of Americans claim unemployment benefits, we have a report from New York on the city's rent strike movement. Hello and thanks for joining us here on France 24. I'm Claire Pride. Now, in a few days from now, most shops will be reopening here in France after an 8-week lockdown. But it's not clear when restaurants and bars will reopen. Same for theatres and museums. President Emmanuel Macron is holding talks today with several representatives of the culture sector, which employs some 1.3 million people. The culture minister also taking part, as are his counterparts from the economy and labour ministries. In the coming hours, we should have some idea as to what the government is planning to do to help. Now, another 330 people have died from COVID-19 in France in the past 24 hours. And the sheer number of deaths mean that Muslims who believe burials should be quick are having to do things differently. Finding an appropriate plot is increasingly hard. And for many immigrant families, COVID-19 has put a stop to the tradition of sending bodies to their country of origin.
Mamadou's father dreamed of being buried in Mali, the country where he was born. But with borders now closed, his family has to organise a burial in France.
Mon père est décédé fin mars, on l'a enterré mi-avril. C'était un délai de 18 jours, c'était énorme. Et pendant ces 18 jours, on ne mange pas, on ne dort pas, on n'est pas paisible tant que le défunt n'est pas en paix.
For nearly 3 weeks, Mamadou and his family tried frantically to find a spot in a Muslim burial ground in France.
Donc là, le coronavirus a permis de mettre en exergue ce manque cruel de carême musulman et cette volonté également d'être enterré de manière digne.
While others are still waiting to hear if the bodies of their loved ones can be repatriated, Abdelsamad Atrache works in a funeral home. Every day, he sees distraught families with the same predicament.
Certaines familles attendent que les frontières s'ouvrent et les mettent à Rungis. Mais ça devient juste pas possible. Ça veut dire que ces familles-là ne peuvent pas faire leur deuil.
In this cemetery in the suburbs of Paris, an 85-year-old woman has just been laid to rest outside the plots dedicated to Muslims. A victim of COVID-19, it wasn't possible for her to be buried in Algeria as she'd wished. Faiza and Samad have long called for the local authorities to expand the size of their Muslim burial plots.
Là, aujourd'hui, il y a eu encore un enterrement. J'ai vu des enfants du quartier, des petits-enfants. Et ça touche. Je crois quelque part, on peut pas rester insensible. On peut pas rester insensible. Et on se dit, si c'est nous qui sommes accompagnés comme ça, moi, je veux pas être jetée au plein milieu, quoi.
There are only a few hundred burial grounds for Muslims in France, out of more than 45,000 cemeteries. A statistic that's proving painful for many families as the COVID-19 crisis continues.
Now, in Germany, the federal government is said to have agreed a plan to lift lockdown measures with state leaders. It will include reopening shops and restaurants on a state-by-state basis. Angela Merkel holding a video conference with regional leaders this Wednesday. For more, let's speak to our business editor, Stephen Carroll. Stephen, what's in the draft plan that Merkel's discussing with state leaders today?
Well, according to reports, it will expand on the lifting of lockdown measures that began in April in Germany. When it comes to shops, currently only smaller shops are allowed to open. That will be extended to all shops under this plan, as long as hygiene and distancing measures are enforced. Schools, which have already been reopened for older pupils, will be reopened to all pupils later this month. And what's being discussed at that meeting between Angela Merkel and the 16 leaders of Germany's states would be states being given more power to decide when they can open bars and restaurants after that, depending on infection rates in their states. So that would give more power to the regions to have control over some of the restarting of the economy in those areas. And that would include things like cinemas, theatres, and even gyms as well. On the sports front, very interesting that there is a plan, or it is rather in this draft plan, that amateur and some professional sports will be allowed to restart. Now, that's been something that Germany's Professional Football Association has been calling for. There are 56,000 people employed by Germany's Football League, and if Bundesliga games are allowed to restart, as is predicted or proposed under this plan, that could happen within a matter of weeks. It would be behind closed doors. Players would have to have a 2-week quarantine before the matches were able to restart. But that would be very important for many of those clubs who are on the brink of bankruptcy now and need matches to restart so that they can continue with things like commitments on TV advertising contracts.
So what state is the German economy in, Stephen?
Well, like many major economies around the world, it has suffered massively during the pandemic. New figures out today showing that manufacturing orders in April dropped to their lowest level on record. Activity as well, economic activity across Germany also plunging to a record low. So the economy in deep freeze like it is in many parts of Europe. But the European Commission has just published its latest forecast for the Eurozone, and it's predicting a historic recession in the Eurozone this year, a contraction of the economy of 7.7% across the Eurozone before a rebound next year that would almost recover from that shock this year. For Germany in particular, the European Commission says the economy should shrink by 6.5%. In February of this year, it had expected Germany's economy to grow by 1%. So that gives you an idea of how much of a difference just a couple of months has made as a result of this pandemic. A similar picture for France. The Commission says France's economy could shrink by 8% this year before rebounding next year. But the Commission says this rebound is contingent on if the infection allows for the progressive lifting of lockdown measures and restarting of the economy. It does expect budget deficits to explode. We had expected that not only because of the income support measures that governments have put in place across Europe. There are more than 10 million workers, both in Germany and France, having the majority of their wages paid by the government as their work has dried up during this lockdown. It'll have to wait until those lockdown measures are lifted to see if those people can get back to work and help to restart the economy.
All right, thank you very much, Stephen. In the US, the coronavirus pandemic is still killing some 1,000 people a day, but Donald Trump has been talking about winding down the coronavirus task force. During a visit to a mask-making factory in Arizona on Tuesday, the US president acknowledged a human cost to reopening the US economy, but said it was time to, quote, bring the country back.
Mike Pence and the task force have done a great job, but we're now looking at a little bit of a different form. And that form is safety and opening, and we'll have a different group probably set up for that.
In the last few weeks of lockdowns in the US, millions of Americans have filed new claims for unemployment benefits, more than 30 million in all. And for many of them, losing their income means being unable to pay rent. Some can't, others won't, and a rent strike movement is gaining steam. From New York, Jessica Le Mesurier reports.
When the landlord came knocking for the rent at the start of the month, Dylan and his roommates refused to pay.
We told him that we were not able to pay rent at the moment because we lost our income. He was not pleased, to say the least. He did not yell or anything. He was just being very upset.
Dylan worked in a nightclub but lost his job and therefore his income when the coronavirus crisis hit.
Food is the only important expense that I can think of right now.
In New York, thousands of people have joined a rent strike movement dubbed #CancelRent. The city has not seen anything like it since the Great Depression. Some landlords, like Mario Salerno, told their tenants they don't have to pay their rent during the crisis. Mario owns a garage in Brooklyn and rents out about a dozen apartments.
Because a lot of them lost their jobs, a lot of them were struggling, a lot of them would have became homeless. So I tell them all to relax, stay home, make sure they help their neighbors, their roommates, they have food on their table.
But Jay Martin, who runs an organisation representing 4,000 landlords across New York's 5 boroughs, says the rent strike is counterproductive.
We have to maintain these buildings. We have to pay property taxes on a monthly basis. We have to pay mortgage payments. We have to pay water and sewer costs, which are through the roof. So all these expenses are still real. They're still there. They're still there on a monthly basis. So when you're saying cancel rent, you're essentially saying we're removing your ability to keep maintaining these buildings and make them safe and habitable for people who are living in them now 24 hours a day.
New York landlords and tenants have called on the local and federal governments to come up with solutions. If they don't, they say the rental housing industry, New York's biggest economic engine, could collapse, leaving tens of thousands homeless.
Now, the latest COVID-19 figures coming out of Afghanistan indicate that at least 3,000 people have been infected and almost 100 have died. The government handing out free bread this week after prices soared. This in a country where poverty is rife. And that, plus conflict, meant that even before coronavirus, the country's health system was overstretched. Shazai Bwala reports.
This public hospital is deserted, including its emergency ward. Before, hundreds of patients walked in here every day, but a week ago, 10 doctors tested positive for coronavirus, so the hospital is largely closed.
هر فرد یا هر پرسنل صحی از کارگر گرفته تا دکتر تا کلگی سر خود مشکوک هستند.
The coronavirus has opened a new front for the country's healthcare system, which has already been tormented by 40 years of war.
War is a threat. It deviates the resources, the focus. It challenges our logistics and operations. We're concerned not to fill in a gap where we forget the essential health services and focus on COVID-19 only.
The virus has infected nearly 300 health workers in Afghanistan and at least 5 doctors have died. The staff in this intensive care unit is very worried. According to a recent survey, 1/3 of Kabul residents might already be infected by the virus.
In the coming days, we might face mass cases in Afghanistan, in Kabul, because the numbers are increasing day by day. We are equipped but not well equipped because we are facing the shortage of the tests. We are waiting for the help of the foreign countries, for the help of the WHO.
The peak of the pandemic is expected in mid-May. According to authorities, 25 million Afghans could soon be infected by the virus. That's 70% of the country's population.
Now, teenagers in Wuhan, the Chinese city where the coronavirus pandemic started, have gone back to school. Their desks spaced 1 metre apart and their temperature taken as they arrived. According to state media, in some places, arrival times were staggered. Officials saying only tested students and staff are allowed to get back to work. Wuhan was locked down for 2.5 months before reopening last month. That's it for this edition. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned.